Welcome to Fight News Now Extra. I'm your host, John Pollock, with John Rambine joining me on the desk as we chat all of today's issues, including the latest on the huge class action lawsuit filed against the UFC. The UFC resigns the Battlegrounds MMA tournament winner, and there will not be any punishment for the World Series of Fighting welterweight champion. As the battle lines are being drawn following Tuesday's announcement of a class action lawsuit being filed against the UFC, there is some criticism being sent toward the plaintiffs. MMA manager John Fosco contacted MMAJunkie.com and believes there is a big difference between what the UFC does and what can be considered a monopoly. He also cited one of his clients, Travis Brown, getting a healthier offer after his UFC deal expired because Bellator was in the marketplace. Fosco also referred to the plaintiffs as, quote, wimps who will have egg on their faces at the end of this. Among the camps that are opening their doors to CM Punk is American Top Team in Coconut Creek, Florida. Lawler tweeted out after his welterweight title victory that Punk could train there and stated on the MMA Hour this past Monday that Punk coming to ATT would prove a lot of people wrong. Punk has been extended invitations by numerous camps, including AKA in California. The latest controversy involving World Series of Fighting welterweight champion Rousimar Palhares will not lead to a fine or a suspension. Palhares submitted John Fitch in a minute 30 of their first round title fight this past Saturday with a knee bar, and CSAC Executive Director Andy Foster called it borderline, but not enough to punish, but was very upset with yet another issue dealing with the welterweight champion. And Joan Carneiro, who won the one-night tournament for Battlegrounds MMA this past October, is returning to the UFC. Carneiro announced the news on Instagram and returns after being cut in 2008 following a 2-3 run inside of the organization. Here with John Rambine, and certainly the biggest story of the day, Joan Carneiro.
Yes.
He's coming back to the UFC. The legacy of Battlegrounds MMA will live on through
American Top Team.
Jonan Carneiro, as Chael Sonnen referred to him numerous times. Let's chat about the huge lawsuit that was filed on Tuesday afternoon. A lot of people expecting this. The day before, kind of news was leaking out about it. A huge antitrust lawsuit, a class action lawsuit being filed against Zuffa. The main fighters that are attached to this, Kung Lee, John Fitch, Nate Quarry. We know Carlos Newton was very much involved with this. What are some of your impressions, just having heard the conference call and some of the news that has come out here? The UFC has basically said they haven't received the case yet. They're going to review it, and not really much of an answer thus far from Zuffa.
Yeah, I mean, from the fighters' perspective, they believe that what the UFC has done, they've created a monopoly, and they've bought up basically any type of competition that would be in direct competition with the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And I think they're referring to, the Afflictions and Strikeforce and WEC and just the whole landscape, just the fighters' contracts. When John Fitch, we know the whole video game situation, that John Fitch refused to sign the video game situation, sign his likeness away. He decided not to sign it, and the UFC released him from his contract, and then he was brought back and he signed the contract. So there's a whole bunch of different issues right there, and the fighters just believe that they've been wronged since Zuffa has purchased the organization, and they want retribution, so to speak.
There's a lot of heavyweight legal teams attached to this. I believe it's 5 big law firms here, and these are experts when it comes to antitrust. But I'm looking at this right now, and it seems to me that the fight would be to get rid of the label of independent contractor that a lot of these fighters have to fall under in order to work for the UFC, or at least be employed by them. And rather than go the monopoly route, I think that's a harder argument to make, especially right now where we're looking at the landscape in 2015, where I feel the UFC has their most viable competition in Bellator than they've had in years. With Viacom behind them, what they just did on November 15th, I think Bellator is absolutely going to make a lot of competitive offers when fighters' contracts are coming due from the UFC at this point. With Strikeforce, with Affliction, those were promotions that they were going under at that point. They were losing money. They were going Silicon Valley Sports and Entertainment. They said, sell this. And the UFC bought them. So I think it's all going to come down to this argument.
It's going to be what sticks. It'll be, everything's going through the sieve, and there's certain things, just like you say, this will work in the UFC's favor. They're going to prove that, yes, there is actual competition, viable competition for us. They'll bring up the Eddie Alvarez contract when the Bellator and the UFC had their negotiations. Same with the Gilbert Melendez contract as well. So certain things like that, yes, the UFC will be protected. But there's other things that the fighters brought up in the sense that the UFC, they control the belt and the rankings, so to speak. So we've been talking in the past, John Fitch being on that list as well. This is a guy that won 12 fights in a row and still, I believe, didn't get his title shot until later. And so it's things like that the ex-fighters and current fighters, they want things changed, that they kind of have a little more control.
Well, I think that there's certainly arguments you can make on a number of different fronts. I think the issue with Reebok right now, I think a lot of fighters could really fight that, and I was somewhat surprised, and maybe they just don't want to open up this can of worms, but on that conference call, they made it clear. They are not looking to unionize here. This is simply, it was very vague. They didn't even have an idea of what's the end goal here? What do you want? And it was this very broad, we just want a fairer landscape. Well, what does that entail? And that's where I think you can't really lock yourself onto too many issues because they weren't really presented in that regard.
No, it's
what
true.
they want out of this.
Right, but I mean, it has to come down to everybody sitting at a table and deciding, what's important. What do we look at? Where can we bend? Where can we be flexible? And I think it comes.
Isn't it telling though, John, that I am sure between us, we've heard numerous fighters with problems.
Yes.
And you'll then get them on the record. They're not going to say any of that.
Well, Brendan Schaub, I don't know if you saw his response when asked about this whole situation. Well, we have Brendan Schaub here. He's like, no. And then he walks off camera because we all know if some of these guys who are currently employed by the world's biggest mixed martial arts promotion, they come out against the UFC, there's a good chance they're not going to be around
Well,
for
look
long.
how many fighters are attached to this lawsuit in comparison to how many are in the universe of fighters. I mean, that's, to me, the ultimate issue with unionization is that this is a sport where it's completely individually driven. If I'm John Jones, am I giving away 10% of my purse right now to the undercard guys now? Why would I want to do that in a union setting? It's great if you're at the top end. It can help the lower end guys, but to have everyone come to the table and make this agreement, I just don't see how it can happen if you're being realistic about it.
It's going to take a long time.
And we'll probably be chatting about it a lot in the near future. For John Ramdeen, I'm John Pollock. More Fight News Now Extra is coming up.